He lies motionless on a narrow bed, Edward Plantagenet III of his name. His silvered hair is matted with sweat, his breath shallow and ragged. The fingers that once gripped a sword with sovereign authority twitch slightly as if reaching for a crown already taken. His eyes are open, but unseeing, locked on some vision beyond the ceiling. No bishops kneel beside him. No great lords wait in mourning. Only servants, silent, cold, and watching like shadows witness the final moments of the man they once called the Hammer of France, of Edward III of England. A name that once echoed through battlefields like a curse. The king who laid the first stone of an empire, who dared to challenge a dynasty older than his own. The warrior king, the father of chivalry, the victor of Crécy, the architect of the 100 Years' War. That is the version of him carved into stone, inked into chronicles passed down through schoolbooks. But what those same pages don't tell you is that Edward III died alone, penniless, forgotten, with his signet ring stripped from his hand before his body turned cold. They don't mention the mother who murdered his father, or the mistress who stole his crown while he still wore it. They don't tell you that the glory he built with blood and fire would become a curse on every son who bore his name. This is not the Edward of heroic legend. This is the Edward left behind in footnotes erased from memory for the convenience of kings who came after him. And if you listen closely beneath the hymns and the heraldry, you might still hear him whispering through the smoke of war, asking the question history has tried to bury. What if victory was the worst thing that ever happened to him? The story of Edward III does not begin on a battlefield, but in a prison of velvet and glass, a royal childhood drenched in paranoia. He was just 14 when his world collapsed in silence. His father, Edward II, a man both mocked and feared, had become a ghost in his own realm. For years the court whispered of his failings, the boyish favourites he lavished with gifts, the humiliating defeats in Scotland, the bitter feud with his queen. Isabella of France, his wife the she-wolf, had once crossed the Channel under the guise of diplomacy and never returned. Instead, she came back with an army, a lover, and a purpose. Roger Mortimer, a baron with a blood-deep grudge and nothing left to lose. Together, Isabella and Mortimer swept through England like winter wind, cold, calculated, and without mercy. They seized castles, bought lords, and claimed the prince. Edward the boy became a crown without a king. The body of Edward II was taken in chains to Berkeley Castle. No trial, no procession, only rumours. Some say he was smothered, others whisper of a red-hot poker. No one speaks with certainty. Only one truth survives: a king died, and his son was made to wear the crown while the blood was still warm. Imagine being 14, your father deposed by your mother, executed in the shadows, and your every move now watched by the man who shares her bed. Edward III ascended the throne in name only. Behind the throne, Mortimer ruled, wielding authority like a dagger hidden in silk. Isabella, his mother, once the embodiment of royal grace, became something else entirely: regent, consort, queen, in all but title. Together they governed through fear and favour, reducing Parliament to a stage play and nobles to pawns. And Edward? He smiled. He bowed. He signed where they told him to sign. But silence is not always submission. For 3 years Edward learned. He watched how Mortimer dealt with dissent, with executions, with exile, with bribes. He studied the way his mother controlled the narrative, how power dressed itself in ritual and ceremony. He attended meetings, rode beside the generals, and listened when they thought he wasn't listening. A boy in public. But in private, something else was growing. A ghost of ambition, a shadow of rage. We often imagine medieval kings as born warriors, moulded in iron and fire. But Edward III was shaped by betrayal. His first political education was that thrones are not inherited, they are taken. That bloodlines mean nothing unless backed by swords. That even the people closest to you can slit your legacy's throat and smile while doing it. And so behind the mask of a dutiful son, the boy king began to build a plan. By 17, Edward had married Philippa of Hainaut, a political match arranged by his mother, but one that would become his only source of honest companionship in a world of spies and sycophants. Philippa was clever, observant. She saw what others missed, that her husband was no longer a boy playing king. He was calculating, waiting, and when the time came, he would strike. That time came on a cold October night in 1330. Mortimer, by now bloated with arrogance, and Lannes believed himself untouchable. He slept in Nottingham Castle, unaware that Edward had quietly surrounded it with loyal guards. A secret tunnel beneath the walls allowed the king's men to enter undetected. There was no war cry, no formal arrest, just footsteps in the dark, steel on flesh, and the sound of a traitor dragged screaming from the queen's bedchamber. Mortimer was tried and executed within weeks, hung like a common criminal at Tyburn, his body left swinging in the wind for all of London to see. A message, a warning, a reckoning. But Edward didn't stop there. He turned to his mother, the woman who had birthed him and destroyed his father. He didn't kill her. No, his revenge was colder. She was stripped of power. Her jewels taken, her household dismissed. She was placed under house arrest at Castle Rising, allowed to live, but only as a shadow of the queen she once was. It was mercy, or it was cruelty in disguise. And just like that, at 17, Edward III had taken back his kingdom. Not with banners or trumpets, but in silence in darkness. He had learned from the best how to wield power behind a curtain, how to cloak vengeance in legality. But what did it cost him? He had no mentors, no father, no guiding hand, save for the one that tried to strangle him. His reign began not with joy, but with execution. His first lesson in kingship was betrayal. His first royal act, revenge. It is tempting to see this as a turning point, a moment of triumph. But for Edward, it was something else. It was the closing of a door, the sealing of a self he could never return to. From that night forward, the boy who had worn the crown was gone. In his place stood a man forged not in glory, but in the quiet, bitter knowledge that power never comes without blood. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the armor, beyond the titles, the ghost of that 14-year-old boy still watched, still remembered. Not the glory, but the silence. Power once taken is rarely quiet. After Mortimer swung from the gallows and Isabella faded into forced retirement, the kingdom breathed a sigh of relief. The shadow court was over. The boy king had become a man. But in the silence that followed, Edward III did not celebrate. He reorganized his council. He convened parliament. He issued charters and reaffirmed the rule of law. The formalities of kingship were now his to command. But inside, where the public eye could not follow, something more complicated was happening. Freedom did not bring clarity. For years, Mortimer and Isabella had been the storm outside his window. Now that the storm had passed, Edward was left alone with the wreckage. No more scapegoats. No more enemies hiding in plain sight. Every decision, every war, every death, every mistake would now belong to him alone. And perhaps that's why he moved quickly, too quickly. By the time he turned 21, Edward III was already consumed with vision. Not just for England, but for Europe. For legacy. For something grand enough to bury the ugliness of how he came to power. He turned his eyes to France, where dynastic chaos simmered just beneath the surface. The French king had died without a direct male heir, and Edward, through his mother, Isabella, had a claim. A thin claim, but a claim nonetheless. To many it looked like ambition, to others, recklessness. But to Edward it was more than either. It was redemption. The war would come later. But even in these early years the seeds were already planted. What's striking is not how quickly he moved toward empire, but how methodically he built the illusion of stability at home. And for that he had one unlikely ally, Philippa of Hainault, his queen, his first and only wife. History rarely remembers her. She appears in the margins usually as a quiet supporter, the mother of heirs, the gentle companion. But that softness was a mask. Philippa was no pawn. She was the quiet backbone of Edward's rule during his most volatile years. She was born in the Low Countries, daughter to a powerful count raised in the art of diplomacy and courtly silence. When she arrived in England as a young bride, she found a country on the brink of collapse, a king under regency, a court at war with itself. But she adapted, observed, endured. She gave Edward sons, many of them, and with each birth she solidified his dynasty. But more than that, she gave him something he had never known: trust. Philippa did not maneuver behind his back. She did not court favorites or forge secret alliances. She grounded him emotionally, politically, and though she rarely spoke in council, her presence calmed the court. She turned his throne into a family, and that mattered more than it seemed, because Edward was a man haunted by broken bloodlines. He had watched his own father be betrayed by his mother. He had seen how easily power could unravel into chaos when kinship turned to suspicion. With Philippa, he wanted to create something different, a legacy without fracture. A royal house not cursed by treachery, but rooted in unity. But ambition, even when justified, has its cost. The deeper Edward sank into governance, the more distant he became from his own humanity. He surrounded himself with men of talent, yes, but also men of violence. The court became a forge of warfare. Horses, armor, ledgers, ships. Even in peace, the machinery of war never stopped moving. And in that movement, something hardened in him. He no longer flinched at death, no longer hesitated to spend lives for strategy. He had known betrayal too young, gained power too violently. And so he ruled with the quiet paranoia of a man who understood what it took to seize the crown and feared what it might take to keep it. There were whispers, of course, that Edward trusted too few, that he relied too heavily on his household knights and too little on his nobility, that his gaze was always beyond England, toward France, toward glory. And while Parliament praised his reforms, some began to wonder, was Edward building a kingdom or a war machine? And then came the personal cost. His eldest son, Edward of Woodstock, known to history as the Black Prince, was raised in the very world his father had crafted, a world of honor, chivalry, and battlefield prestige, but also a world without softness, without space to fail. The prince became everything Edward wanted: brilliant, bold, adored by the army. But in private, he was fragile, ill, haunted. Just like his father, the prince learned that greatness in the public eye rarely reflected peace in the soul. Philippa too began to fade. After years of loyalty and quiet strength, her health declined. Edward visited her bedside often, but rarely for long. War and court demanded too much. And when she finally died in 1369, Edward broke in a way no one expected. He withdrew, not just from the court, but from himself. For the first time, England saw its warrior king uncertain, wandering. He fell under the influence of Alice Perrers, a woman of no noble blood, whom courtiers loathed and chroniclers despised. She wore the Queen's jewels before Philippa's body had gone cold. She sat beside the king in council. She whispered in his ear when Parliament spoke. But was Alice the cause of Edward's decline, or merely a symptom? Without Philippa, Edward lost his tether. The old ghosts returned. His trust fractured. His vision dulled. And the man who had once overthrown tyrants now seemed too tired to see tyranny creeping back into his court. Through greed, through favoritism, through the very structures he once swore to reform. It is easy to remember Edward III as the grand architect of English military glory. But beneath that image is a man who spent his entire reign trying to outrun the ghosts of his own rise to power. He dethroned a tyrant, but feared becoming one. He trusted few, but clung to those he loved with desperate dependence. He created a legacy, but watched as it twisted into a burden his children could not carry. Power for Edward was never a triumph. It was a scar, a weight, a flame that lit the path forward while slowly burning everything behind him. He ruled for 50 years, longer than any English king before him. But the boy who took the crown in blood never truly left the throne. He simply learned how to wear his wounds in silence. They called it chivalry. They called it honor. But when the flames reached the fields, when the screams echoed across valleys, and the riverbanks ran dark, those words meant nothing. The 100 Years' War did not begin with a declaration. It began with a claim, quiet at first, like a match struck in the dark. Edward III believed he had a right to the throne of France, a legal right traced through his mother Isabella, daughter of the French king. But what began as a question of bloodlines quickly became something else, a crusade for legacy, a stage for power, a war not of years but of generations. And Edward, still young, still hungry, saw in that war a chance to immortalize himself. He crossed the Channel in 1338 with banners high and armor gleaming, not as a would-be invader, but as a righteous heir reclaiming what was stolen. His army sang hymns, his knights wore the cross, the court poets wrote of destiny. But destiny looks very different when it reaches the ground. The first campaigns were brutal. Edward's forces didn't march in tight lines of glory, they swept through northern France like a plague. Villages burned, granaries were emptied, wells were poisoned. What they couldn't take, they destroyed. This was not battle. It was starvation by design. It had a name, chevauché, the scorched earth raid. It was efficient. It was terrifying. And it was Edward's preferred tactic. Even Crécy, the battle that made him a legend, was less a clash of chivalric might than a carefully orchestrated slaughter. His archers, positioned on high ground, hidden behind stakes, tore through waves of French cavalry like parchment. The flower of French nobility, charging in brilliant armour under fluttering banners, fell in heaps, arrows in their throats, mud in their lungs. The battlefield became a graveyard, and Edward didn't flinch. His son, the Black Prince, just 16 at the time, fought beside him. It was his first taste of war. It would not be his last. They called it a triumph. Crécy became a legend overnight. Songs were sung, tapestries woven, but buried beneath the praise was a darker truth. The battle had not broken French power, it had broken French confidence. And that fear would spiral into chaos, into civil unrest, into decades of suffering, far from the reach of knights and crowns. Poitiers followed. Another victory. Another field soaked in blood. This time the Black Prince led. Older now and even more ruthless, he captured the French king himself, John II, and marched him to London in chains. England cheered. Gold poured in. Edward's court swelled with riches, prestige, and the illusion of invincibility. But the cost? Thousands of civilians starved in the wake of every campaign. French towns, once bustling with trade, became wastelands. Entire regions were depopulated not by sword, but by hunger, exposure, and plague. This wasn't just collateral damage, it was policy. Edward understood something most kings of his era did not, that war is won not just on battlefields, but in fields of wheat. You don't need to kill an enemy army if you can kill their ability to feed one. It worked, but it left a stain history struggles to scrub away. The image of Edward as the father of English chivalry, wise, brave noble, doesn't fit with the man who authorized the destruction of entire provinces. It doesn't fit with the quiet records of mass civilian death, or the letters from priests begging the crown to spare churches that were looted anyway. Even the so-called chivalric code bent under the weight of the war. The Black Prince, raised on stories of honour and gallantry, oversaw massacres in Limoges. According to chronicler Jean Froissart, the prince ordered the city sacked after a brief rebellion. Men, women and children slain without mercy. Some historians now debate the accuracy of Froissart's account. But the smoke was real. The bodies were real. And the trauma echoed for generations. What makes this war so haunting is not just the violence, but the way it was celebrated. Parliament applauded. Taxes were raised willingly at first, then reluctantly, then violently. The common people, crushed by levies and hunger, were told their suffering was part of a greater cause. That glory was worth it. That England's future depended on French soil being soaked in blood. But the war never really ended. Victories were followed by stalemates. Stalemates by rebellion. The more Edward conquered, the more fragile it all became. Castles needed to be garrisoned. Nobles needed to be paid. Roads had to be kept safe from bandits, many of whom were former soldiers turned marauders. The army had become its own beast, and beasts are hungry. Edward's generals, many of them sons of the aristocracy, operated with increasing autonomy. Some raided for profit. Others ruled French towns like personal fiefdoms. What began as war for a crown turned into war for wealth, loot ransoms land. The lines between king and mercenary blurred, and back in England the cracks began to show. The war drained the treasury. Parliament grew suspicious. Rebellions flared. The peasants' revolt would come later in the next reign, but the seeds were already here, in overtaxed villages, in young men sent to die for a throne they'd never see in a country, slowly forgetting why the war had started at all. Even Edward himself began to fade. His early energy, sharp, precise, relentless, gave way to illness and fatigue. After Philippa's death, He became increasingly detached from policy delegating to advisors with their own agendas. Alice Perez whispered in his ear. The war dragged on. Victories became rarer, defeats more common. France, though battered, did not break. In the end, Edward did not live to see his dream fulfilled. He died before the war could be won or lost. But he had set something in motion, something too vast to stop. His descendants would inherit not just his crown, but his war, his myth, his curse. Richard II, Henry IV, Henry V, all of them would walk through the fire Edward lit, and many would not walk back out. They called him a great king, and he was. In war and vision and scope, Edward III was unmatched. But greatness is not the same as goodness, and glory in the end is only one side of the story. The other side lies in the blackened fields of Normandy, in the empty homes of Gascony, in the silent bones of children caught between banners. He built an empire from ambition, but it was made of ash. It began with a funeral, not of a soldier, not of a nobleman, not even of a king, but of the one person Edward III had never questioned, never feared, never had to guard against. Philippa of Hainault, his queen, his anchor, the quiet constant through 5 decades of war and court intrigue, died in 1369. The official records are restrained a long illness, a public mourning, a burial at Westminster. But for Edward, her death was not a footnote. It was the unravelling. He had survived betrayal, civil war, plague, the deaths of friends, of enemies, of sons and brothers. But this was different. Philippa had been the last living thread tying him to the version of himself before the crown hardened around his soul. Her death didn't just leave a void. It opened a wound that never closed. And into that wound stepped a name the chronicles would not forget. Alice Perez. She appeared quietly at first. A lady in waiting, an ornament of the court. Young, clever, striking, but not noble, not royal, not safe. Some said she caught Edward's eye during Philippa's illness. Others claimed she seduced him after the Queen's death. But no one disputes what came next. Alice became the most powerful woman in England. She wore the Queen's jewels, sat beside the King at Parliament, whispered in his ear during council meetings. She was not his wife, nor even officially his mistress. She was simply there, always there, radiating influence in a court that had forgotten how to speak her name without fear, and the court despised her for it. Chroniclers, writing in the cloaked language of loyal disgust, described her as greedy, manipulative, vulgar. They claimed she sold royal favours, swayed court cases, enriched her family with lands meant for veterans. They called her a serpent in silk, a merchant in a crownless court. But behind the venom, another question lingers. Was Alice Perez truly the architect of corruption in Edward's final years? Or was she the perfect scapegoat, a woman without a title, without lineage, without protection, who dared to stand where only queens had stood before? It is easy to hate Alice, but it is harder to understand her. She did not poison the king. She did not seize the throne. She did not launch wars or raise taxes or destroy dynasties. What she did was far more dangerous in a royal court governed by blood and gender. She was present, visible, unapologetic, and in a time when power wore armor and titles, Alice wore velvet and laughter, and wielded influence not through lineage, but proximity. She was everything the lords feared, a woman who did not ask permission, and Edward, he didn't care. He was old now, tired. Grief had carved lines into his once youthful face. The war he started was slipping from his hands. His sons were dead, dying, or drowning in their own ambitions. Parliament had grown bolder, his advisers more ruthless, the crown heavier. Alice was a distraction, a comfort, perhaps even a mirror of everything he had once scorned and now silently craved: freedom from rules, from appearances, from the cold expectations of kingship. But as his health declined, so did his control. The Black Prince, his golden son, his warrior heir, was dying of a wasting disease that left him barely able to lift a sword. His younger son, John of Gaunt, circled power like a hawk, with clipped wings, too ambitious to ignore, too unstable to trust. Factions split the court. Parliament railed against royal spending. And Edward, once the great commander, now struggled to rise from bed. When he did speak, it was often through Alice. And so when the backlash came, it came for her first. In 1376, a parliament later called the Good Parliament moved against her with fury. She was accused of corruption, of manipulating justice, of profiting from royal decrees. She was banished from court, her possessions seized, her name blackened in ink that still stains the record. But even this was temporary. Edward called her back less than a year later. By then he was barely conscious, and some say it was not affection, but habit, that brought her back into his shadow. Others suggest she returned for survival, knowing that once the king died, she would be hunted by every man she had once defied. When Edward III died in June 1377, there were no parades, no national mourning, no grand memorials. He died in obscurity, in debt. Surrounded not by nobles or sons or scribes, but by servants. His signet ring was stolen from his body before the last breath had left him. The father of English glory, the architect of empire, gone with barely a whisper. It is tempting to blame Alice for this ending, to draw a straight line from her arrival to his downfall. But the truth is more bitter. Edward was not destroyed by a woman. He was destroyed by time, by the length of his reign, the weight of his ambition, the war that never ended, the grief he never voiced, the past he could never bury. Alice Perez was not the storm. She was the smoke that followed the fire. And perhaps that is why Edward III has faded from memory, not in shame, but in exhaustion. His reign was too long, his victories too distant, his final years too broken to fit the mold of a hero. He was not forgotten because he failed. He was forgotten because history could no longer carry the contradiction of a king who had conquered everything and lost himself in the process. The last breath of Edward III went unnoticed by history. No solemn procession filed through the streets of London. No tearful nobles stood at his bedside. No choir sang his legacy into the heavens. He died as he had come into power, quietly surrounded by shadows. It was June 21st, 1377. He was 64. Once that would have been a marvel. But there was nothing marvelous left. His sons were gone or dying. His court fractured. His war unfinished. And England, which had once roared his name across the fields of France, now turned its face to another crown, one younger, cleaner, more malleable. The boy King Richard II, his grandson, ascended the throne within weeks, and Edward's body, once regal, once feared, once loved, was barely cold before it was violated. The records are blunt. His chamber was looted by his own servants. The royal treasure vanished, his garments taken. Even his wedding ring, the symbol of a marriage that had grounded a reign, was pried from his lifeless hand. There was no outcry, no inquiry, no punishment, only silence. And in that silence, something else began to stir, not grief, but erasure. Edward III, the most powerful English king of his century, the architect of a military revolution, the father of chivalry, was quietly swept aside. His name remained in charters, on coins in stone. But his story, his pain, his triumphs, his decline was buried under layers of polite forgetting. Why? Some say it was the natural decay of memory. An old king replaced by a young one, a dynasty turning its page. But others whisper of something colder, a deliberate campaign to cleanse the throne, to smooth the way for Richard II and those who stood behind him. Edward's final years had been messy, scandalous, politically dangerous. To glorify him would be to raise uncomfortable questions about his mistress, about his failing health, about the sons who died too early or schemed too loudly, about the war he had started and could not finish. Better then to distance the crown from its aging ghost, to build Richard as a new beginning, a boy untouched by the sins of the father, a monarch for a new generation. But ghosts don't stay buried. Edward's war lived on. The 100 Years' War, once a banner of destiny, became a bleeding wound. Richard could not stop it, nor could Henry IV, nor Henry V, nor even the iron-fisted Henry VI. Each inherited not just the throne, but a kingdom slowly cracking under the weight of ambition turned rot. The war that Edward launched for glory had broken the structure of feudal loyalty. It empowered nobles, bankrupted kings, and scattered English blood across lands most peasants could never point to on a map. In time, those fractures would widen into civil war, The War of the Roses, a conflict so brutal, it would consume Edward's own descendants in fire and betrayal. Somewhere in that chaos, the memory of Edward III continued to twist. To some, he was a model king, valiant visionary, a sword raised against tyranny. To others, he was the first domino, the man who confused conquest for order and left the kingdom chasing shadows of empire. But what's most haunting is not how he was remembered. It's how willingly he was forgotten. A king who ruled for 50 years, who brought France to its knees, who saw victory, grief, and decay in equal measure. Reduced to a footnote, his tomb sealed beneath a stone floor, most visitors walk across without noticing. There is no grand monument, no whisper of regret, just echoes. And if you listen closely, you might still hear him. Not shouting, not weeping, but asking, what is a legacy if all it leaves behind is silence? The chamber is empty now. Tapestries hang in silence, colours dulled by dust and time. The throne, once the centre of a continent-spanning ambition, stands alone. Its wood cold, its velvet faded. No crown, no king, only echoes. And beyond the window, in some distant memory, the soft thud of horse hooves fades into the mist. That is how history ends, not with drums or trumpets, but with footsteps walking away. Edward III once made Europe tremble. He defied popes, shattered dynasties, and turned a small island kingdom into a military force that redrew maps. But for all his power, all his triumphs, history itself recoiled at the mess he left behind. He was a legend in his prime, yet a shadow in his death. History only remembers what it wants to remember, and sometimes it forgets on purpose. It forgets the king who died alone, stripped of everything: his ring, his wealth, his dignity. It forgets the woman who stood by him for decades, buried without fanfare, while her husband wept behind closed doors. It forgets the blood-stained fields of Crécy and Poitiers, where honour blurred into horror. It forgets that the war he began for glory became a curse haunting his children, poisoning his dynasty, unravelling the kingdom for a century to come. Maybe that's why Edward III was buried, not just in stone, but in silence. His victories became too uncomfortable, his legacy too dangerous. To remember him fully would be to confront the cost of empire, the fragility of kingship, and the quiet tragedy of outliving your own myth. So we ask you now, not as students of history, but as its witnesses, who truly writes a king's legacy, and who decides when it should be erased? Edward III is gone, but somewhere beneath centuries of dust, his story still breathes. Not in chronicles, not in statues, but in questions sharp, unquiet, and waiting.